Hello, everyone. Welcome back to STATEC Research's seminar on measuring progress and well-being. So I am Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. We have Chiara Peroni and Francesco Saracino also online. And today we are pleased to have Dr. Emma Pleeging speak about how hope mediates the relation between income and subjective well-being. Today will be our last seminar for the season, but we'll be back in January, so please check our website or look for emails with additional details. Emma will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your question in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording the event, so you'll be able to find this and past recordings on the website and on our YouTube channel. Now to introduce Dr. Emma Pleeging. She is a senior researcher at the Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization, also known as eHero, at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Her work focuses on the role of positive experiences, such as happiness and hope, in society, organizations, and for individuals. She has written extensively on the meaning, relevance, and measurement of hope from an interdisciplinary perspective. Indeed, she has published 6 papers on hope in international journals since 2020. One received a Best Paper Award, and her dissertation on hope also received a Best Dissertation Award in 2022. Personally, with some interest in optimism and hope, I am very much looking forward to this presentation. Without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Emma Pleeging. Emma, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Kelsey. It's really nice to be presenting for, I think, partly at least a group of people whom I've gotten to know through ISCOLS, of course, and through mutual interest, I think, in the topic of hope and well-being. So it always makes me very hopeful and always makes me feel very happy to be talking about the subject. I will start with just a bit of a discussion on hope in general, and then dive into a specific paper which was published a few years ago on the mediation between income and subjective well-being. But to start first a little bit on why hope. Why is it important to study hope, or at least why do I think it is important to study hope? And for me, a quote which really nicely summarizes what I think is the beautiful and important and valuable thing about hope is written by the American author John Green. And he says, hope gives us, as a society and as individuals, what we otherwise wouldn't have had, a chance. And he wrote this, or actually he recorded this quote when he was discussing the Chilean mining accident from 2010, which I don't know whether everyone remembers, but this was a case where there were over 30 miners were locked into a vault, a mine very deeply below the ground. And for, I think, several days, both the miners underground and the people above trying to rescue these miners didn't know whether they were still alive. But still, both of them continued to work towards this kind of hope of maybe they are still alive, maybe we can rescue them. And then after a week or so, they finally got like a paper from the ground. They drilled down, they got a paper back from the ground with the message, the 33 of us are all right, we are in the refuge, and we are waiting for your help. So with only like rations for a few days, they have been able to sustain themselves for several weeks underground, just waiting until help would come for them. And for me, this is really an important lesson about hope. Like, if we do not hold on to hope, even when we have no clear evidence that things might be better, we will not have a chance. So for me, hope essentially is about the belief that the future is uncertain and that this uncertainty is actually a positive thing, so that positive outcomes are possible. And for me, the opposite of hope is not fear, because fear is also uncertain, but the opposite of hope for me is the belief that the future is set in stone and that there are no possible ways of things becoming better. And the important thing about hope is that it's very agentic. It motivates our behavior. So also in empirical research, we see that hopeful people are more creative, they're more sociable, they are more resilient, and also that hopeful people are healthier and live longer life, which is, I think, a very important paper by Carol Graham and Kelsey himself, which shows that really hope gives us life. A third point is that hope often is the reason why positive circumstances translate into higher subjective well-being, which is of course something that we try to study in this paper on the mediation of hope between income and subjective well-being, which I think is because people are such forward-looking creatures. To have positive circumstances is very nice, but because we are constantly thinking about the future, like the instability, not knowing whether positive circumstances will also extend to the future, really makes it hard for us to be happy with what we have. So we really, it's just in our nature for hope to be important for our current well-being. What are the mechanisms behind this positive relation between subjective well-being and hope? I think an important one is the theory of to broaden and build by Barbara Fredrickson, which is the idea that if you have a positive emotion, this creates kind of like a growth mindset, which causes people to experience more new things. So because you have this growth mindset, this feeling that things are positive and that you are able to experience and try new things, makes us try more, and in turn learn more skills, learn more knowledge, gain capital, which increases our likelihoods to have positive circumstances. So it helps us to start studies or to start a new job, to invest in our future, and then in the future to have a better life. And I think hope is particularly important in this case, as it allows us to deal with uncertainty in a constructive way. So I think the very special thing about hope is that it allows two truths to be true at the same time. So when we are uncertain about the future, for example, you see this a lot when people who are battling with a disease. You do not know whether the future is going to be positive or negative. But because both truths could be possible, it also allows you to be prepared for possibly a negative outcome, while still also finding some kind of solace and some comfort in the idea that things might work out as well. So this allows us to be resilient, to deal with adversity, but it also motivates us to act when we are actually quite pessimistic about the circumstances. So I think for me personally, climate change is such a case where for me it's very difficult to see how things could get better, but being hopeful, being aware that the future is uncertain, it still allows me to keep on working towards a positive future, which is still possible as long as the future is uncertain. This does not mean that more hope is always better. Hope can often be used to exclude people. So, for example, in the Netherlands, we have this saying of migrants are often called happiness seekers. So it's the people who are looking for happiness in our society but do not really deserve it. I think it's also something which is very striking, I find, about the US political situation, where, of course, you had Obama with the very hopeful statement, yes, we can. And then you have Trump with also a hopeful statement, make America great again, but a very different idea about who deserves to be part of this hope and who does not deserve to be part of it. And also false hopes. So stating something can get better, whereas actually this isn't like possible, can be used to mobilize large of groups, but can also be it can also lead to societal disillusionment and disappointment, which can become a very toxic breeding ground for extremism and other negative societal emotions. A last point why more hope is not always necessarily better is the idea of passive hope. So, for example, there's this study on hope and behavior towards more sustainability. So in this particular study, people were manipulated to feel more hopeful about the future of our climate, which did mean that they did become more hopeful, and also were more committed. They said they were more committed to act on behalf of sustainability, but this didn't actually change behavior. So even if you're more positive about the future, it does not mean that your behavior will also be more active towards achieving it. And also a very important thing is that hope is actually least present among those who need it most. So I didn't translate these statistics, so they're still in Dutch, but I think they very clearly show kind of like the difference between groups in society. So the first one is people who are employed versus unemployed, high versus low income, high versus low education, loneliness. So we see that there's a very big difference between people who are rarely lonely versus people who are very often lonely, and health is also a big difference. So you can see that actually the people who might really need hope because of their loneliness, their socioeconomic circumstances, or their health, actually feel hope the least. Okay, so what exactly is hope? I think it's very helpful to borrow from different disciplines in this case. So the standard definition is a definition which is used in philosophy, where hope is broken down into kind of two components, which is desire and uncertainty. So it's something that we want, but of which we are always uncertain whether we will attain it. Following this definition, hope can be both active or passive. It's usually focused on the future, but it does not necessarily need to be so. And it's often socially constructed. So it's also very much dependent on your culture, what kind of hope you feel you are allowed to have and should have, and what is possible for your particular situation. It's important to note that hope is different from optimism. So optimism is kind of the disposition to think that things will turn out well in the future. But this does not require you to act. So there's not this focus on uncertainty, which allows you to change the future and to make use of kind of the uncertainty in favor of your hoped for outcome. So that also means that optimism is generally less agentic. And also in research, we actually find that if you compare hope to expectations, generally there are kind of like similar relations with behavior, with well-being, but hope is often like a stronger correlate of these experiences rather than expectations. But I will discuss that a little bit more further on as well. Okay, within behavioral economics, I think there are kind of like three perspectives which are already important in research. I think especially with Carol Graham advocating for the study of hope within economics, a lot of new research has come out, but I think before aspirations and expectations were more common topics within the research field. And they all have different ideas about how hope is related to well-being and hope is related to behavior. To start with aspirations, which is kind of like, well, here it states income level, but it could also be a level of welfare, of well-being that people find sufficient, so that it's the kind of thing that people want. It's a goal for which people are prepared to invest time and effort and money. But your capacity to aspire is very much bounded by a particular context. So this is kind of, I think, important research which shows that, which I think also applies to hope, the degree to which you are able to see yourself in different, more positive futures is very much determined by what you think is possible for you personally, what other people will allow you, what organizational structures will allow you, how society views you and your right to be happy. And we can also see that changing circumstances will also increase or change our aspirations. So I think in a negative kind of way, you have the idea of adaptation. So the more income you generate, the more you get adapted to a new situation. And the more actually your aspirations are also growing. And it's probably also due to social comparisons. So as your financial circumstances change, you compare yourself to a new group, which means that you are actually wanting more and more, which is also, of course, this kind of like adaptations trap where you constantly need to earn more in order to be satisfied with your circumstances. So therefore, the idea is also that income, for example, possibly does not increase life satisfaction as much, which is, I think, of course, that we do find a relation between income and life satisfaction, but the relation isn't as strong as we would expect, partly because our aspirations increase in proportion to our income. So some empirical research indeed finds that income increases aspirations, which causes life satisfaction to decrease. On the other hand, poverty can also induce aspirations failure. So having a very low income can also mean that people become to have fewer aspirations and be less ambitious and try for fewer goals. Then for expectations, which is kind of related, I think, to optimism, an expectation, I would say, is the assumption we have about how the future will turn out, which is stands separate from our effort. So it's just what we expect will happen in the future. And the importance and the value of expectations in economic theory has been highlighted, I think, from three kind of important perspectives. So the first one is the expected utility theory, and the idea that people are rational beings and that they objectively weigh probable outcomes. So in this case, expectations are kind of like a risk assessment, where what we expect will happen determines how much we are willing to invest to improve our future. But it's a very objective, rational choice. Of course, I think reality is much more messy and kind of less rational. So prospect and regret theory states that people have systemic biases in how they view the world, and therefore expectations are not always in relation to reality. So here we also find that people prefer certainty over uncertainty. So expectations can also very much influence what kind of risks we are willing to take. And I think a third view, which has been studied in the last few years, is the idea of anticipatory savoring. So the idea that positive expectations in themselves are something that we enjoy and therefore find valuable, and also something that people are willing to put money and time and effort towards. So this would explain, for example, why people buy lottery tickets. So even if we know rationally that the chance to win the lottery is almost negligible, we still buy those tickets because the idea, the possibility, the savoring in advance that we might win the lottery is just something that we value in itself. Okay, from empirical research, there is a lot to show that indeed these expectations and these positive expectations especially are something that influence our behavior as well as our well-being. So for example, we find that income expectations influence life satisfaction even if you control for income and savings themselves. So even if you are currently fine with your income and your savings, then still it really matters how you view the future. And even when controlling for demographics, we see that expectations of future financial well-being affect our well-being at the current moment. The same goes for unemployment. So the negative effects of unemployment really depend on whether you think you will be unemployed in the future as well. And also we see that if an outcome is worse than expected, so kind of like the disappointment, this also has a negative effect on your well-being. So this is kind of the idea of disappointment. If you have expectations which are very high and which are not met by reality, then actually on the long run, positive expectations are going to be detrimental to your well-being. Now, hope is kind of different, especially because currently it's mostly studied within the field of psychology. So the standard definition is that of desire plus uncertainty, which is also sometimes called endorsed desire. So that's the idea that it's agentic, it's something that people are actively working towards, which is also, I think, represented in one of the most used theories on hope, which was developed by Rick Snyder, who states that hope is a cognitive set that is based on a sense of successful agency and pathways. So it's the idea of agency, I am able to achieve my goals, but it's also an idea of pathways. So kind of resourcefulness in finding different ways of getting towards your goals. So this is often measured with questions such as, I'm able to overcome obstacles and I have different ideas of how I could achieve my hopes. And within using this definition, there has been a lot of research on how hope mediates the relation between subjective well-being and a whole range of different circumstances, mostly psychological experiences, such as finding meaning in your life, personality, feeling your life as a purpose, secure attachments, self-compassion, religiosity, and income inequality and stress. So this kind of shows that to a large degree, hope is the reason why current circumstances lead to higher or lower subjective well-being. So the idea that even if things are positive now, it really matters to us whether we feel the future will be positive as well. So why do we think this is so, hope is so important in translating our current situation into higher subjective well-being? I think possibly it's because people enjoy those positive beliefs in themselves, and possibly it's also in this broaden and build theory, the idea that being able to improve your future also actually makes it so. So it's kind of like this vicious circle where believing you can achieve something will put you in a mindset where you will also be able to achieve more. However, there are very few studies on objective characteristics, so showing how objective circumstances of our lives, such as income, can translate into subjective well-being through hope. So that's something that we try to do in this specific study. It's a 3-wave panel study of US working population. We conducted this study already a few years back, so between 2016 and 2018. Respectively, we had about 511, 340, and 205 participants. We measured subjective well-being through life satisfaction on a scale of 0 to 10. And hope was measured with the adult trait hope scale. So this is the scale which is related to the definition of hope as proposed by Rick Snyder, so the idea of agency and pathways. And we used a fixed effects model. So that means that we are looking at changes within persons. So whether a change in life satisfaction or a change in income relates to a change in life satisfaction and hope. Okay, so this is a very big table, but I will try to explain step by step what the results are. So in the first model, we see that life satisfaction is positively affected by income. So we measured income as a categorical variable. And here you see that compared to the lowest categories, there's an increasingly higher rate of life satisfaction related to each income category. Now, when we control for hope in the second model, we can see that there's still a significant positive relation between income and life satisfaction, but these regression coefficients diminish. And then in the third column, you can see the difference between the first and the second model and whether this difference is significant or not. So here you can see that only for the highest income categories, there's a significant difference between the model where we do and do not control for hope. So this does mean that including hope in our model, so controlling for hope, the importance of income for life satisfaction becomes lower. Then for the second step, we also study whether or look into whether income increases our hope. And there we can also see, this is the last column for model 4, we can see that for higher income, people actually do become more hopeful, but only from an income of $1,800 or more. So what this tells us, let me just skip through a little bit, that the relation between income and life satisfaction is mediated by hope. So you see that the total indirect effect through hope is significant in 1.3, but the total direct effect is 3.4. So this is kind of just to show you like the magnitude of the mediating effect. So about 28%, a little bit less than a third of the relation between income and life satisfaction in this case is mediated by hope. So that means that for a part, income indeed makes us happier because it makes us feel more hopeful. Now, why would this be the case? We have also therefore looked at the different components of hope. So as I discussed before, this particular hope instrument measures both agency and pathways. So agency is the idea that you are able to achieve your goals, whereas pathways is more about resourcefulness, being able to deal with obstacles and setbacks. And here you can see, if you look at the second and third, fourth, the fifth column, so there you look at the difference. The second column is the difference for agency, and the fifth one is the difference for pathways. And there you can see that the difference is much larger for the agency component compared to the pathways component. So this is something which indicates to us that possibly it's especially important if your increased income allows you to feel like you can make a difference in your future, that you can achieve the goals which are important to you, rather than feeling that you are able to deal with setbacks and obstacles. Then we also wanted to test for a disappointment effect. So the idea is that if you would have very high expectations, this might actually negatively affect your well-being, because circumstances are never going to be as rosy as you expect. To do so, we run both regressions with nonlinear transformations of hope and expectations, but here we've also plotted them. I think it's a little bit easier to see for hope rather than for expectations, because expectations were only measured on a 3-point scale, which is something I really regretted when starting the analysis, but sometimes you have to make do with the data you have. But something which I think is quite remarkable for the hope data, at least, is that you see this very linear trend for the predicted life satisfaction compared to your hope. So the more hopeful you are, the higher your life satisfaction is going to be. And we do not see like a dip at the end where higher hope is actually kind of like harming your life satisfaction, or at least not being as helpful. And this is also something that we did not find for expectations. So this idea of disappointment is not something we found in this data set, at least. Maybe also important to note that the last point on this slide, that although expectations appear to be a less strong mediator, so whereas hope mediated about 28% of the relation between income and life satisfaction, this was only for about 14% for expectations. We did find that expectations actually mediated the relation between income and life satisfaction throughout the income distribution. So although expectations might be a less potent motivator for life satisfaction, or at least in this data set, it does affect people throughout the income distribution. And the reason that we think that hope might only mediate income and life satisfaction above a certain threshold is the idea that the threshold is $1,800, which is a monthly income which equals at that time for that particular group of people. So those were mostly 2-person households, is similar to the poverty threshold for the US. So we think that possibly if your increased income is insufficient to make substantial investments in your future, it will not make you more hopeful, which I think makes sense. Like if you're only making just enough money to be able to pay the rent, but not to pay off your mortgage or to start a new education or to invest in your future in really like a substantial way, it will not make you feel like the future is going to be more positive. I think that something which is I think important to take away from this information, the idea that hope is very important for translating your current circumstances into life satisfaction, is the idea that income stability is something which people value, which is I think also something which comes from the work of Emmanuel de Neve, who showed that like I think the very well-known idea of loss aversion, like a loss is more detrimental than a gain is rewarding to most people. This also shows that if we have higher income, it's very important for us to have the feeling that this higher income will also allow us to have a positive financial future as well, and not just something which happens now but might disappear again in the future. And I think it also really shows that hope is an important experience if we want to understand economic behavior and if you want to increase well-being as well. Okay, I think I would like to leave it at this. I think I spoke quite quickly, so I think I made up for a little bit of a delay in the start. Are there any questions about this research? Shall I close my PowerPoint?
Emma, you can, as you wish, that's fine. We'll move to individual screens. So first off, thank you very much. That's helpful background on a subject I imagine people don't know that well, but it's important for us to get to know. So please, type in the chat or raise your hands. The first question we had was from Leos. He asked a little bit earlier on, are there empirical psychometric differences between the constructs of hope and optimism?
Yeah, very good question. There is some research within psychology on the difference between hope and optimism. I think it mainly shows up in the agentic part. So whereas hope is really more closely related also to life satisfaction, so more closely to different measures of subjective well-being, but it's also more closely related to people being willing to, for example, start a study, having aspirations when it comes to their future, investing in their future. So there are there are empirical difference between hope and optimism.
Thank you. Yes, everyone, feel free just to type in the chat or to raise your virtual hands. And I'll take that opportunity then to ask a question. So Emma, I'm thinking, if I'm interpreting this correctly, you say that more income buys agency, and partially, and then that's part of the reason why income affects life satisfaction. And in this case, would you also say that could it be self-efficacy? That because it's this, but it's increasing the sense of self-efficacy after a certain point, and you think that you're able to accomplish certain things. And then maybe, I don't know if you can distinguish between internal locus of control, self-efficacy, and hope. Yeah.
Well, very good question. I think this is also one of the criticisms of the Snyder model of hope, stating that the Snyder model, which I discussed, like agency and pathways, it's very similar to self-efficacy. So even if you look at the instrument to measure self-efficacy, it's almost the same items as the agency part of the hope scale. I do think that when we compare this specific instrument to measure hope to different instruments to measure hope, we do find that there is a slight difference in the sense that it's also kind of related to trust. So it's this idea of not only am I able to achieve my goals, but I also trust that my environment will allow me to achieve these goals. So I think in that sense is a little bit different from self-efficacy, which is very much like from the perspective of the individual, whereas this agency part of hope is a little bit more socially constructed, a little bit more dependent on what your environment will allow you to achieve, which I think is also like the tension between reality and your beliefs about reality is of course a very difficult one in hope, because like hope is a good thing, but you don't want false hope. So there's always this tension between, is it good to believe you are maybe able to do a little bit more than you realistically are? Or is it more important, better for your well-being, to actually be very realistic about your abilities? So I think that's also why, like in future research and also in like subsequential studies, I've started to adopt different instruments, because I think that like this Snyder theory is very much a Western perspective of hope, which is very individually constructed, doesn't really allow for maybe even like spiritual components of hope, which is very important in different cultures throughout the world, we found. So a combination of different instruments allows more for this like trust, spirituality, social surroundings, which are all very important for hope. I don't know whether this answers your question or whether
Actually,
it's something more, but
no, I think actually that's a great answer, tying into something I was thinking about earlier. But we'll let Francesco go. And just real quick, Francesco, I think there's also Enrico Beneto. Maybe you were going to ask a question. If you would just raise your hand, because I'm not sure I caught you correctly. But Francesco, your hand's up. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Kelsey. Thanks also to Emma. There's a lot to struggle with here, because this hope is something that I perceive a bit as slippery. I don't manage to grasp it. But a couple of very direct questions. One is, I understand that hope is something difficult to measure empirically. You used a scale, so my assumption is that this measure is not that widely available for empirical analysis. So do you have some recommendation about which kind of measures we could be looking for if we want to, trying to join you in this field of work? And second, one of the reasons why I find this concept slippery is that I have the feeling that it overlaps, at least in part, with social capital, which is something on which I've been working more. And I believe that there are many reasons why social capital and hope should work together to make you believe that the future can be improved, or that we can do something about the future. So are you aware of any study that tries to disentangle the interaction between these two? Any possibility to do that?
Yeah.
I have also some other comments, but I will stop here, and maybe if there is time later, I will continue.
Okay, great. Yeah, I am curious, because I think even though like social capital, your topic, and hope seem like different things, I always find like when I'm reading your articles, I think they're so close together. So I really agree with this idea that they have some kind of special relation. But to get to your first question, measuring hope, I do think it's difficult empirically to measure hope, especially because it has been studied most extensively within the field of psychology, where multi-item scales are generally used to measure these kinds of constructs. But of course, if you would want to study hope within an existing larger data set, then you don't have access to these multi-item scales. So I think something which is getting as close as possible is something which Kelsey and Carol, I think, have done, using expectations. So looking into how expectations affect us, and assuming that even though they are not like in detail exactly the same thing, we do see the same kind of relations for expectations as we do for hope. So they are a very good first one to get a feeling for how expectations affect us, and how hope might also affect us. Something which I have kind of like toyed with the idea, but I haven't tested it out yet, so that would be something for the future, is seeing whether you could make like a combination between expectations and aspirations. So the idea is that hope is desire plus uncertainty, and expectations kind of have this uncertainty, like to what degree do you feel the future will be a certain way, whereas aspirations are more about what do you want the future to be like. So if anyone is interested in studying the topic, I would be very curious to see whether like the psychological multi-item skills of hope are linked to a combination of aspirations and expectations, which are I think concepts which are present in most large data sets. Then in regard to your second question, the idea of social capital and hope and how they are related, I think there is some work on this relation between hope and more social constructs, but it's something which is not done as a lot in Western cultures. So most of the research on social hope has been done within Latin America. So I cannot think now of the author, but I can send you the papers where there are like two social components, I think, to hope. So you have, on one hand, you have the object of the hope, which can be social. So this is something which has been termed vicarious hope. So it's the idea, it's not a hope for yourself, but it's vicarious in the sense that you hope for someone else. And actually studying the types of hope people have generally in like a society, we see that in most societies, a large proportion is actually vicarious. So a large proportion isn't hope for ourselves, but hope for someone else. And especially, for example, hope for your children or for your partner or something like this. It's also, we have a hope barometer, but there's also another hope barometer project, which is run by Andreas Kraft from Switzerland, which studies each year within different societies throughout the world what are the types of hopes that people have. And often those hopes are very much social for other people. But then also you have other people as a source of your hope. And this is something, the locus of hope is also something which has been studied. I think it was Du, which is who is studying the idea of friends and family, but also a spiritual being, a spiritual system in which you believe, which can be religious, but it does not need to be religious, also is often a strong source of hope. So people often derive hope from this. I think that there's also another component which is more like societally constructed. So the idea of trust. Trust and hope are very closely interlinked, and especially among people who have low trust, we also see very low scores of hope. And this is something which is more studied, I think, within the political sciences. So the idea of how hope is distributed within society, and how people might feel that they are hopeful for themselves, but not hopeful for society as large. This is something we find in very many societies. So in the Netherlands as well, if we study how hopeful people are and what their expectations are for the future, they're actually very optimistic about their own futures, but not very optimistic about society at large, which is, I think, also, it's like part of the goal of the object of their hope, but it's also the source of their hope. They don't feel like society is contributing to their happiness. So I think that's also a very interesting discrepancy, where social capital, believing like the world is generally a benign place, people are generally well-meaning and will help you to achieve your own goals, helps you to feel more positive about the future. Does that answer your question a little bit?
It does, and actually opens other questions, so it's great. Thank you.
Okay. We still have some time.
Francesco, yeah, I have questions too, but right now I'm not seeing anybody else raising their hands. So,
I think in
oh,
chat
sorry,
there is
Ashley
something.
B. Yeah, I'm sorry, Ashley B. I missed you. Ashley, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask directly, or otherwise we can read it out for you.
Well, I tried to write it out so that I wouldn't have to stammer too badly. Just thank you for the presentation. I think actually my first reaction was, as an aside, was in strategy, we often advise people when they're trying to do strategy as a group that hope is not a strategy. But now you're having me rethink that, given what you're writing. But more seriously, yesterday in the iSchool presentation that Kelsey also moderated, there was a study looking at income and happiness. Now they were using not the life satisfaction measure, but essentially the mood one, which takes account of the different some of the adjective descriptions. And my interpretation, and Kelsey, I stand to be corrected, was that there was a relatively weak association between happiness, as in the moment happiness, and income. And I'm wondering whether hope would have been a better proxy in that, assuming that variable had been available, as a way of helping to understand that mediation that they were trying to do yesterday with the item. And so that's just, I'm just trying to link up what I'm learning in two different presentations that I think overlap, but I'll ask others to interpret it. The other one relates to, since hope has an implied action in the way you were describing it, I'm wondering whether the relationship between hope and sense of purpose in life and meaning may be yet stronger than simply the life satisfaction being that derived aggregate measure.
Yeah.
Sorry, Emma, if I will, I'll just add a tiny bit. So yesterday it was happiness was measured using the daily reconstruction method. So part of the implication would be that, your study shows that happiness is related to, that income is related to life satisfaction. The previous one says that, income is not related to moment happiness. And so it suggests that hope may not be related to the daily reconstruction method. And perhaps it's because of agency. And I think that's a little bit what Ashley's getting at least initially. And then there was the second part to his question.
Yeah. So I think the first remark I think is very, very important, and I think also something which has come up in different studies showing that income is indeed related to life satisfaction up to a certain point. Like after a certain basic needs are met, income becomes less and less like marginal returns. You get marginal returns on the increases in income, so it becomes less important to increase your life satisfaction. But when you start to look at happiness, for example, which is already a little bit more the emotional component, as well as the cognitive component, the evaluative component of life satisfaction, then the relation already becomes smaller, which is also something that we find, like we in our mediation analysis, we both look at life satisfaction and at happiness, and we see that the mediation is especially strong for life satisfaction. Whereas for happiness, it becomes less. And I think if you use like a daily reconstruction method, or even if you look at emotions, not on a daily, like on every day, but over a longer period of time, then there's even a lower correlation, because I think like if your basic needs are met, you're not going to have more fun with your friends because you have a higher income. So I think income, it does make you feel like your life is positive in a certain way, but it's not going to give you that many more positive emotions. And I think the sense that income and hope are related, I think the relation is like partial. And I think that's also an important lesson from here, that income doesn't necessarily make us more hopeful, which is in the Netherlands, we have this trend, and I think it happens more often in different societies, where we have increasingly short-term contracts. So that means that people have an income but don't know what their life is going to be like in a year from now. And the idea is that this will stimulate economic growth. But if you look from the perspective of hope and stability, and the idea that knowing that the future is going to be positive as well, it's not a very smart move. So I think in that sense, hope shows the robustness of the effect of our improvements in our current circumstances. I feel like I'm babbling into a different direction now, but it's just something that I find interesting. Your second question on purpose, there's a very strong relation between hope and purpose, and I think that's especially related to the spiritual component of hope. We've done a study where we compare how hope relates to subjective well-being, both in the Netherlands, which is a very secular, non-religious country, and in a few countries in South America where religion is a much more like common part of life. And there we see that the spiritual component of hope is very important to subjective well-being in more religious countries, which is partly explained by its relation to purpose. The idea that it's kind of like this hope because I think that there's a benign meaning to this life. I believe that there's a positive direction, which is the context for my personal hope, which also gives me like this feeling of direction, of purpose. I feel like you asked something else, but now I've lost it. Whether you wanted to ask something else in relation to purpose.
Well, I'm just going to pick up briefly on this on purpose and meaning, but it strikes me that you cannot explain a lot of political protest without having an implied sense of hope, because desperation alone won't get people to do things. And so while it's often translated in terms of a religious dimension, it must be something in terms of you think by your actions you'll do something, you'll achieve something.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like despair is probably not going to motivate people, but what I do think there's a difference in what is called promotion and prevention hope. So promotion hope is the idea you want to achieve something, you want to go towards something, whereas prevention hope is kind of based on fear. So in that sense, fear and hope are kind of two different manifestations of the same experience, namely the future is uncertain. And of course, we know that fear can be a very strong motivator. And in the same sense, I think hope can be very strong. And as you say, you're not going to do anything if you don't believe your future is going to be affected by your behavior. So in a sense, I think it's very hopeful, the idea that giving people the feeling that their actions can change the future will motivate them. On the other hand, I think there's also well, we need to be very aware of the effects of disappointment. I think, for example, the Obama era was a very hopeful era, I think, for a lot of people, but the disillusionment of realizing that not everything that we hoped for was going to change also left like US society in a very vulnerable state. The idea that it felt like an unprecedented time where things were going to be achieved which were never before achieved, but then reality, of course, is more messy, and things aren't going to be as beautiful as we thought they were going to be. And then people had been mobilized and had been doing stuff to achieve this change, and then disappointment left them, I think, in a very negative way, which is something I think Carol Graham really picks up on in her studies, showing that like these deaths of despair, the idea that a lot of poor white people in the US are currently very disillusioned and like literally dying because of the disappointments they find throughout life.
Thank you, Emma. I actually missed a question. I'm sorry, Anna Shirakanova. So Anna asks, could you comment more on the distribution of life satisfaction and hopelessness, or sorry, excuse me, hopefulness in your study?
Yeah. Yeah, the distribution. That's very interesting. I think for hope, we find a similar distribution as for you generally find for life satisfaction, happiness, at least within, I think, most Western countries, which is like a right skewed distribution, with most of the people scoring like around a 7 on a scale of 0 to 10. But with substantial, like a small increase in like the lower part. So it kind of seems like people who are feeling hopeless, there are some people who feel very strongly hopeless, and then there's kind of like this dip, and then it becomes like most people feel generally hopeful around the 7, and like the height, I think in the Netherlands it was kind of a 7, whereas in the US it was kind of an 8. So if we compare different societies, we see that there is a societal influence on how hopeful people feel themselves to be.
Thank you. What kind of study are you looking at to, or set of data to compare different countries? And then also, are there studies that look at changes in hope over time? I know you do a fixed effects analysis, but I'm wondering, what can we do, perhaps other than becoming more religious, to increase hope?
Yeah, good one. So to compare different countries, we have gathered our own data. So unfortunately, we are not doing it anymore. But over a few years, we collected data from the same group of people within the Netherlands, within Belgium, within the UK, the US, and several countries in South America. Which was really something, because we also wanted to compare like these spiritual, social, these different components to hope in different cultural circumstances. So in the future, I would really like to look at whether this combination of expectations and aspirations might be a good proxy for measuring hope. And I think it's also very important, because hope, even more than happiness and life satisfaction, I think is very much influenced by our culture and how we perceive this this experience. Your second question was
How to change it over time?
How to change it, yeah.
Within individuals or within countries, either way.
Yeah. Sorry, I had a long day, so my brain is a little bit fried, but I'm doing my best.
We're pushing you lots of questions. I apologize for that. So thank you for staying with us.
It's really nice. It's very interesting. I think it's really a topic which will become more and more important, because as we are finding more positive correlates to hope and how big of an influence it is on our life, I think it becomes more and more important and also wise to understand how can you increase hope. There are several studies which look at the causality of hope. So I know of one study which really looks at hope at like a school going age, like for youngsters, how it affects their future. So there you see that there seems to be a causality. Being hopeful in your youth will help you achieve your goals as you get older. Because of course, often you have a selection effect where people who achieve more also become more hopeful, but there seems to be really this causal or implied causal relation. Then there are also, within psychology, there are some experiments on how you can increase hope. And I think the most promising ones to me are the ones which target trust, so which go into like this social dimension of hope, which go into resourcefulness. So how well are you at dealing with obstacles, with setbacks, and also just to give attention to your desires. So that's also something, like I think it differs a bit depending on which culture you live in or which society you're in, but generally it's not something that we tend to discuss a lot. What are your hopes, and what would that future look like? And also use a little bit of imagination and creativity in imagining different futures and how these futures might be, what they might look like. So I think it has been in vogue kind of like to be pessimistic and to be a little bit cynical. And in the end, I think it's not a very helpful disposition. I think we want to work towards a disposition which acknowledges the challenges and acknowledges the difficulties that there are in our situation, but also tries to look at, okay, and then what can we do? What is possible? And can we be creative in different ways of achieving these goals? Because I think hope helps us persevere, not because of the evidence, but in spite of the evidence. Like, even if we don't know how the future could be more positive, we can still be motivated to act to achieve it. For me, a very important influence is thinking like of resistance fighters in the Second World War in the Netherlands, which is something which is kind of like ingrained in our culture and our social background, is this idea that even if you do not know how to win the war, you will have to keep on fighting and thinking that it might be possible even if you do not know how. And I think that's the powerful thing of hope. Even if you do not know how the future can be more positive, it doesn't help you to not think about it and not keep working towards it.
Emma, that's great. I think you gave us cause or motivation at a minimum to be more hopeful. I think that we could keep you busy for a long time with additional questions, but we are after time now. If anybody has one last burning question, now's the time. Otherwise, I think we will we'll close today. And thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, everyone, for attending and sticking with us. Great talk. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma.
Have a nice evening or morning, depending on where you are.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Emma. It was great seeing you. Looking forward to meet you in person anytime soon.
Yeah, you too. In Rotterdam.
Yeah, sure. Or Luxembourg in June. Who knows?
Yeah.
Take care. Have a good evening. Bye.